Hey everyone, it's Anne. We're making today's full episode free for everyone. There are no ads and no juicy bits tucked behind a paywall. If you want to join the ranks of paid subscribers so you always get the full ad-free episode, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It makes it so I can split everything that we make straight down the middle with Melody, which is how much her work is worth. It also makes it so that we can do whatever we want. We can talk about whatever we want. We can focus on whatever we want and have whatever guests that we want without other people telling us what we can and can't do. And I don't have to read any ads for products that I don't necessarily love. So if you want to make the show sustainable and support independent media, go to culturestudypod.substack.com. Thank you so much. Okay, on with the show.
A lot of times I cook recipes because on the podcast we're interviewing somebody, and so I will go through a cookbook and find something that's unique to me. So one of the most recent recipes I cooked was a kefta wrapped in grape leaves from Fadi Katan's new cookbook called Bethlehem, which is a Palestinian cookbook, because the recipe was something that reminded me of something my grandmother cooked.
Yeah.
What else? Oh, my boyfriend and I really wanted to make shrimp, so we bought some shrimp, and then we remembered an old Alison Roman recipe, shrimp with too much butter. So we just did that. So based on memory, a lot of times, like, oh yeah, didn't we do this thing one time? So that was another. And then what else? Oh, my late Auntie Julie has a tabbouleh recipe, a very smelly, delicious recipe for kind of a Armenian bulgur-based tabbouleh. So I made a cookbook 10 years ago that's very kind of primitive cookbook, but I pulled that open to find her recipe.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Lilah Raptopoulos, and I host the Life and Art podcast from the Financial Times. And I write a lot about how cultural identity is passed down through food and preserved through recipes.
Do you cook a lot in the summer?
I assemble a lot in the summer.
Yeah.
What about you? I try to do cold.
Well, and the worst thing is that, so I live on an island, as other listeners to this podcast know. Like, I can't, it's sometimes hard to get heavier things if you're walking on the ferry instead of driving on. And so I haven't replaced the propane in my grill.
Right.
So the grill is not in like, how have I gotten this far into summer and I haven't grilled at all? But I do a lot, like, and I, in the evenings I like to spend more time in my garden, so I think I just spend less time thinking about cooking, or I love in the winter cooking like a huge pot of soup or stew and having that like on the pot all day. And now I'm like, I'll just have like a giant salad, like a salad the size of a bed. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly. Yeah, totally. I'm waiting for I just keep trying with the tomatoes.
Yes.
But, that doesn't happen till it happens. But you're right. It's like in the summer you want to cook something really fast, or you want to assemble something cold.
So we're going to talk a lot more about like you assembling recipes, the cookbook that you fashioned, all that sort of thing. But I'd love to know how you learned to cook. Like, what are your first memories about it?
I learned to cook, I think, from sitting in the kitchen with my mother, who she would sort of quickly assemble things that her mother would make. And so I sort of had memories of my grandmother's cooking that then I would kind of watch my mother make, and she would say, like, all right, you do some of it just to get just to get it into my hands. So, for example, one thing that she cooks a lot as like an act of kind of love is this thing called cheese bedeg, which is also known as tidopita in Greek culture. It's like a phyllo dough and butter, like 20 layers, and then a bunch of cheese in the middle, and then phyllo dough and butter on the top. And it's like, when it bakes, it's like warm. It's like all cheese and butter. But it's a very kind of a ritual act. And so making it was like, that's a really early memory of cooking, is making that sort of thing.
I learned... My mom came up with all sorts of like creative things to entertain my brother and I, and like as kind of after school enrichment when I was younger. And she did this thing for me and like 4 or 5 of my friends when we were in elementary school called kids cuisine, and it was named after. There were like these little TV dinners called kids cuisine, which were, in hindsight, absolutely disgusting, but like my most coveted thing in the whole world. And so I think she was kind of playing with that idea. And what it was is my friends would come over to my house and we'd learn how to cook something.
Oh, cool.
My mom would teach us how to cook something. And some of it, I can't remember the exact recipes, but I do know that we like learned how to separate eggs, for example. Like some of it was basic skill stuff. And I think I learned how to bake cookies pretty early.
Yeah.
And that's a great skill as a kid that you can be
Totally.
like, oh, I want cookies. I'm going to bake them.
Right.
and really started
Real adult
experimenting with different like small variations on the cookies, and eventually came up with what I think of as my secret recipe, which again, we'll talk about secret recipes as we go through this episode. Like to the extent that they were known as like Annie's cookies in my town. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, it's also special because usually the thing that someone has a name for, that person is like 85 years old.
I know, right? And then I also have many memories of my grandmother, who's Norwegian, cooking various Norwegian dishes. And all of these Norwegian dishes, this is something I've really come to understand only with time, are very much Norwegian American dishes because the Norwegians who came here were all poor.
Right.
And so the food that they made was peasant food and cheaply assembled, not very many ingredients, very, very straightforward, which is why when I went to Norway, I was like, wait, where's all of the stuff that my grandma would make it? Because it's just very different types of food.
It is different. It's one of the things that I find most interesting about all of this is that like culture lives on kind of reliably through food, right? Like especially if someone's displaced or they immigrate somewhere else, like the language falls away after a generation. Sometimes some superstitions remain, but like the religion matters less to our generation too. But then food, it's like sneaky. Like food you can pass down easily. It makes you feel nostalgic for the person that brought it here. And then that food, obviously, as you were saying with your grandmother, like it just changes based on where it lands.
Yeah.
Which is also really
absolutely. Cool. And that as a kid, you don't really understand any of that except for this is what my grandmother makes, right?
Right.
And oftentimes it's different than what other grandmothers make.
Yes.
So it's special in some capacity.
Yes. It really does occur to you as you get older.
So I've been trying to figure out how to do an episode about food and recipes since Melody and I first came up with the idea for this podcast. And like we just had this line in our kind of our ideas area that just said like food blogs. And, but we couldn't nail it down. And then you and I were talking about, we wanted to have you on the show and like what are some ideas? What do you want to talk about? And you wrote this beautiful email about all of the ways that you relate to food and think about food and food as legacy and like recipe culture. And there were just so many directions that we could take it. So that helped us. And then we knew too that our listeners would help us nail it down.
Yeah, their questions are amazing.
One of the things that we talked about in our emails is that there's too much choice. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. I've been thinking about this, that the sort of nature of online cooking and recipes has gotten to the point that it's like unsustainable. It feels like very unruly.
Yes.
I obviously have a personal interest, so I have a lot of cookbooks. I have maybe, 50 cookbooks. I maybe buy like a new one every month or so. And I'm realizing that increasingly I'm reading them like in bed, like novels, more than I'm reading them like actual cookbooks to cook from, although I cook from them sometimes. But then I have, like everybody, the New York Times cooking app, and they're putting out, I think about 100 recipes a month now.
It's wild.
Which is an unbelievable number. They could just recycle from the back end. They could just kind of pull them back up from the past.
I know,
I would too. It's just stressing me out. Obviously, the FT puts out recipes, which I also want to try. I get a few Substacks. Tamar Adler's Substack, Hetty McKinnon, some chefs that I really like. So sometimes I think, I use them. And then in a pinch, I find myself Googling things. And then there's like an endless slog of recipes. And I don't know. I barely use a lot of them. I like save them, and I save them on Instagram and on TikTok and everywhere. And they're very disorganized. And I feel like we haven't really figured out what we're doing here and which ones we actually care about and why we're saving them. And it just feels compulsive.
Right. And I also fear for the future of these recipes because like with all digital culture, like there's just no assurance that they will live on in the place that they previously lived, right?
That's true.
So what about like big food feelings? This is such a huge question, but like why do you think that food and recipes and cooking give people like why are there so many opinions?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that like food is one of the most emotional mediums or senses or taste is, I don't know. Food is one of the most emotional topics or mediums, partially because it holds like everything in it. It holds every sense. You smell, you taste, you all that. It holds a lot of memories, and as you talk a lot about on the show, nostalgia for previous times. You know, in good ways and hard ways sometimes. It transports you back, and also it like goes into your body, and so it also it like holds all of these questions about health and nourishment and self-care and taking care of yourself. So that
Diet
also feels like it matters. Diet culture shit, definitely. And
like
also like sustainability shit, you know, you're
yes,
like, you know.
Where are you getting the ingredients?
Exactly.
Did you grow the ingredients? Like
are you wasting money
Yeah.
on too much food? All that stuff.
Yes.
Sorry, go
Right.
ahead.
No, I think about the fact that like there was a magazine called Cooking Light that I like that
Yes.
was incredibly popular amongst millennials and our moms for a very long time.
I know.
Whew.
Dark times.
Yeah, so no, that's a great answer for a very difficult question. It leads us into our very difficult questions from readers. Okay, so we're going to talk about the internet's role in cooking, the legacies of family recipes, and then in the Ask Ann Anything part of the show, we're going to answer questions about how we actually keep our recipes organized and about paralysis of choice, like the stuff that we've kind of talked a little bit about already. But for our first question, we're going to hear from one of our paid subscribers. This is from Leah.
Looking for good recipes feels like when you all are talking about clothes. There's one or two places I trust, America's Test Kitchen, Cooks Illustrated, and if they don't have the recipe I'm looking for, it's a crapshoot. What makes a recipe good?
Oh,
Such a good question.
Such a good question. And I feel like my understanding of what makes a recipe good has changed with time. Because it used to be what makes a recipe, for me personally, it used to be what makes a recipe possible.
Oh, interesting.
Was what made it good.
Right.
And
what do you mean by that?
Meaning I used to cook on a grad school budget. And so there would be all sorts of garnishes that if that was essential to the recipe in any capacity, no way, right? If the cheese was an expensive cheese, no. If the meat was an expensive cut of meat, like anything more expensive than chicken, no.
Yeah.
So those to me, I could look at a recipe and understand it was a good recipe or know from previous experience that it was a good recipe, but it was an inaccessible recipe to me. That also, I think, is true for a lot of people when it comes to ingredients. And, you know, the availability of spices online has really changed the game, but I still think that there are a lot of people who just like don't have the capacity to find ingredients for various recipes locally, especially if they live pretty rurally. So that's part of it for me too. But I don't think that actually answers the question.
I mean, and a recipe that speaks to that is a good recipe sometimes. Like a recipe that says like if you don't have this, use this, or if that's too expensive, use this, or all that.
Yeah. No, and so one of my favorite recipes is this recipe that's been handed down through my family for kung pao chicken, which was taught to my mom by her fellow teacher in Minneapolis in the early 80s. And her fellow teacher was Taiwanese and had learned how to fashion a version of kung pao chicken with the ingredients that were available to her in Minnesota.
Cool.
And so that meant like no black vinegar. It meant a mix of like wine, I think, in substitute for probably rice vinegar. So like wine, soy sauce, some sugar.
Yeah.
Like just a whole mix of things to kind of to create that aura of kung pao chicken. And that's what I grew up with. And then you use Spanish peanuts for the peanuts. And usually we use like the dried red pepper, some sort of red chili, which would give it its flavor, but none of the like no 5-spice or anything like that. And I love that taste. I know it's not quote unquote authentic, but I know it's also the result of someone trying to find the most authentic version that they could make of their recipe with what they had.
And also, isn't that beautiful, right? I think one of the questions that I find myself asking over and over, although there isn't really a good answer, is like, how do you preserve recipes from the place that they came from, but also let them like adapt and change to wherever they land? Like, can you have both? Is it okay that they change? You know, and it like is amazing that they change actually. And what everybody tells me is just like, you know, write down the old way and then do whatever you want.
What makes a good recipe for you?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I think I have to disclose to your listeners that I'm a pretty good cook, but I'm like mostly interested in it as like a form of preservation and a form of communication. So I like can't tell you the way Eric Repair or something would tell you what makes a recipe good or bad. Like I don't know about balance. But my instinct in response to that question is that I would like discourage people from trying to optimize for like, okay, this recipe is definitely going to turn out the best that it will possibly taste, and just like use it as a chance to explore. So like I would try to learn the basics from like what Samin Nosrat teaches us in Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And then if you're interested in like, you know, you read a story of a chef that kind of interests you and they have a recipe for something, then like try it. Or if you have a piece of fish and you heard about this home cook, you know, see what they have for fish. Or, you know, I'm interested in Sichuan food and I know Fuchsia Dunlap has this seminal book in English for Sichuan food. Let me choose like an easy recipe from that. Kind of, I don't know. I would go by the messenger.
Yeah. And I think also for me, having some sort of explanation of like why you're adding the thing is helpful as a okay cook. Like I love, this is so basic, but when they're like, add some lemon juice at the end for some brightness.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, that's why I'm adding the lemon. That's why I spent 79 cents on the lemon, which I never would have done in my like previous cooking iterations. But like that makes sense to me.
It is. I also really love when, I don't know why more recipes don't do this, but when the ingredient list is separated between like, here are the things you probably already have in your pantry. Like you have garlic, you have salt and pepper, you have olive oil. And then on the other side, here's the stuff you'll probably have to buy. And then as you're kind of going through the recipe, they're like, you know, I always want a recipe to be like, add the 2 eggs, add the half a cup of something so that you're not like going back and forth trying to.
You know, my biggest recipe pet peeve, and I totally understand why they have to do this in the cookbooks, is when the sauces are in the back.
Yes, totally agree. I know. A
you
lot
just keep losing your place. You're like,
Yeah.
But I get it when they're using it. Like, just reprint the sauce 3 times. I would love to have it next to every recipe that uses that sauce.
Yeah. It's also really nice. I agree with what you were saying about the lemon juice. I love when a recipe kind of talks to you like a normal person.
Yes.
Like it's a person talking to a person. I find that very helpful and relieving.
I love that you mentioned the idea that like we can't just be looking for the most optimized. Like I love America's Test Kitchen, but it definitely is like a millennial optimization. Like, oh, this is going to be the best, right? Or if you're looking even at like the star ratings in New York Times Cooking. Yes. Like sometimes I find myself being like, I'm only going to cook 5-star recipes.
I know.
Which is not great either.
I know. I struggle with that. I totally struggle with that too. And also, I was thinking also about you know, the internet is so big that so many people see different things. Like some people read blogs as a way to get recipes and others use America's Test Kitchen. Yeah, I was surprised by that too. You wrote in your newsletter recently, I think it was about People Magazine, about those sort of bland, forgettable brands that like churn out content. And that includes websites like allrecipes.com and Simply Recipes. And sometimes if you just Google roast potatoes or like lemon vinaigrette, that's what comes up and you start to rely on their random star system. And I find all that just try to, if it's not that good, you learn something.
Right. That's the thing. It's like, and I wish we could embrace this a little bit more. And it's, I think, particularly when you think of cooking as a hobby, sometimes it's hard to feel like you are pretty mediocre at it. You're like, if I'm going to do it, if I'm going to spend time, if I'm going to spend money, then I should do the best thing instead of like, it's great to be a dilettante in the kitchen.
And the best chefs and cooks like made a lot of bad things.
Yes. Okay, our next question is one that we got back in February that helped spark the idea for the whole episode. This is from Jessie.
What's going on with food blogs? It seems like there has been a big backlash lately. I've seen so many variations on the complaint, I don't want to read your life story, I just want a recipe for chili. But I remember in the heyday of food blogs, the early aughts or so, the appeal of food blogs was not just the recipes, but the opportunity to peek into the lives of the writers. I'm thinking of people like Deb Perlman of Smitten Kitchen, Molly Weisenberg of Orangette, Joy Wilson of Joy the Baker, etc. I'm sure part of this is market saturation. It seems like everyone started a narrative-driven food blog around this time, myself included, so now the internet is full of way more cooks and life stories than we have the capacity to care about. I think there's an SEO angle too. Google prefers long-form content, so some bloggers will churn out a lot of words that aren't necessarily saying anything. But I think something has fundamentally changed about the way we interact with blogs, too. Even Joy the Baker now has a jump to recipe button, so readers can skip the chit-chat. And the chit-chat itself has a cursory quality these days, as if she knows no one is bothering to read it. Are we just tired of this format? Do we feel like the writing is a paywall of sorts? Like, I shouldn't have to pay for recipes, and I also shouldn't have to read anything about them?
Really great.
Okay. I think Jessie is so spot on with all of these observations, but what do you think?
Oh, I was going to actually, I love that quote, the writing being a paywall of sorts. Like that as a way to think about it is really funny. I'd be curious what you think. I mean, I don't think I have a great answer to it. Part of it, I think, is related to the kind of organic push and pull of how much content and personal disclosure and story we think people want on the internet. I feel like that kind of comes and goes. And that blogs like don't have editors. So there's like space. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's like a small scale celebrification that's going on here, right? That's always been part of it. You are allowed intimacy through the little stories at the top, which makes you feel a connection, which makes you feel like the recipe might be better, for better or worse, right? I think that people don't understand just how essential the personal narrative was for getting sucked into the recipes in the first place. Smitten Kitchen might be slightly different here because I feel like it's become such a big phenomenon. Like people through the cookbooks especially, that even if you weren't reading Smitten Kitchen in the like late 2000s, you can still understand like the legibility of a Smitten Kitchen type of recipe, like is enough that you don't need to know Deb's personal narrative. But I also think one thing that's interesting is like the viability of these sites has gone down because SEO has failed us, right? Like it's no longer you can't make enough money simply through SEO. So you have like some blogs have opted to have the billion pop-ups, because it's the only way to sustain money, like an actual stream of money that makes doing this as a full-time job viable. And some have switched to newsletters, which are much more direct and also, okay, I'm going to have a little preamble and then I'm going to have the recipe. And I also think they're a little bit more storable in that form, in that you can like search in your email instead of search the entire internet. Exactly. Some cookbook writers and recipe authors that I know don't paywall their newsletters at all, but many do for more recipe content and that sort of thing, which also makes it more sustainable.
That's true. Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. I don't know if we're actually answering the question here about where this is all going, but
I don't know either. I think that's right. When I heard that question, I thought, actually, I don't read food blogs anymore. I do rely on Substack and Instagram and old school cookbooks. I've gone back to them. In a way that's really interesting. But it did make me wonder how people feel about how much the personal is entwined now in cooking. Like cookbooks used to be just like, actually, I'm going to teach you best practices for cutting and balancing and flavoring, etc. And now, like, a lot of them are based around cultural identity or personal identity. And I think a lot of people complain about that. But I actually think it's great.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, too, is that so someone like Julia Child, like maybe the cookbook itself didn't have those aspects of her personality in the cookbook, but people had access to her through different modes, right? So she had already been celebrified through her appearances on television.
And part of why they liked her cookbook is because they loved her.
Right. She made French cooking seem accessible. And I think that now that accessibility is a mix of blog, newsletter, podcasts, appearances on various shows, right? Like the different reality shows, that sort of thing. But I think if you want to sell a cookbook now, and it would be interesting to talk to a cookbook editor about this, but I think now if you want to sell a cookbook, you have to have an Instagram following. You have to have some sort of cult of personality around you.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, the publisher, they're like, why? For the same reasons that a publisher will say no to various other authors. Like, you have to have a platform. And so the way you develop a platform is through narrative and personal information.
Otherwise, why do we need another recipe for eggs?
Yeah. And like, which fair. And like, sometimes some of these cookbooks are reinventing the wheel 17 times over. And some of them, I think, are introducing us to like different and innovative ways of thinking about our food and the way that we cook and family and vegetables.
Yeah, I totally agree.
That sort of thing. But,
yeah, I totally agree.
So the second half of the show, we're going to talk a little bit more about like family recipes and the legacy of cooking. So I'd love to hear about the legacy of cooking in your family.
Sure. It's a lovely question. So I'm writing a book about this like region in what's now Eastern Turkey called Anatolia, which is a region that both of my grandparents are from. They were Greeks and Armenians who lived there for generations. It's also kind of Asia Minor, that area. And until about 100 years ago, there were just like tons of cultures who lived there. The Greeks and Armenians, Turks, Kurds, Assyrians, Jews, Coptics, just it was like kind of full of people. And it wasn't without its issues, but it was under empire. It was under like the Greek and the Roman and the Persian and the Ottoman Empire. So it was like a place that was a fusion for cultures and foods. And a lot of recipes that we know about and foods that we know about kind of come from that area. Like, it's hard to know all actually all these things, but they say the Armenians brought sort of yogurt from that region to America. Baklava was one of the earliest recipes from that area. Wine, they like started coffee shops there in the, 15th century. But when the Ottoman Empire fell, many people were displaced, many forcibly. My mom's family survived the Armenian genocide and ended up in the U.S., and my dad's family did this transfer of populations and ended up in Greece. And my grandmothers spoke different languages. One spoke Greek and the other spoke English and Armenian. And they were different in many ways, and they cooked basically the same. And the foods that they made were like very familiar. They made dolma, they made yalanji, they made kefta, they made chereg, and they had slightly different names, but they just tasted the same. And when they met each other, they kind of like were like laughing about the fact that the food was the same. And so as I've gotten, it's like very much a form of nourishment in my family, and a form of like, it was like a thing that survived. And kept our cultures alive, especially on the Armenian side. But it also made me realize that there are cultures all over the world that have been like displaced and that have moved and that are like doing this combination of preserving and fusing and merging cuisines. And it made me really interested in all that.
Well, and it's so complicated too, because I feel like there is, I think, very good discussion lately about, okay, so if I want to make a certain type of curry, maybe I should look for a recipe that is written by someone who comes from that tradition instead of a white person who has adapted an existing recipe to make it more palatable to white people. And then there's also this current of like I've seen a lot of recipes, like Palestinian recipes recently, that when we feel helpless about what is going on in a place in the world, or feel like we want to keep something visible, the way that we do so is by honoring
Yes.
that culture through seeking out recipes that matter, right?
Right. We make maklube or something.
And there are also so many recipes that do matter, right? That have meaning infused into them through the centuries.
Yeah. Adding to that complication is one that, like, there's things like curry powder is a kind of colonial invention, right? It was, like, invented by British colonizers to get the feeling of Indian food in the West. And then adding another level is just like the kind of nationalist fervor that can sometimes be an undercurrent under a lot of these recipes. Like if you ask a Greek and an Armenian and a Turk what their coffee is called, they'll call it their coffee, when really it's the same. It's the little, coffee with the grounds on the bottom. If you talk to an Italian about pizza, they don't want to know that pizza was kind of brought from Napoli to New York and then kind of made into the pizza it is today and then brought back. It's it's fascinating.
Right. Which means that we have lots to talk about. So
totally.
First question comes from another one of our paid subscribers, Kate.
Why are people so possessive over sharing family recipes? Is it a regional or cultural thing? I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and I cannot fathom being so territorial about keeping a secret recipe, but the internet leads me to believe that it is not uncommon. Why?
Classic Pacific Northwest question here. It's like, we don't have any culture. Why would I keep anything a secret? Or like, we don't have any accents, or when absolutely there is culture and accents and all sorts of things.
So
not
funny.
limited to the fact that Idaho is the home of fry sauce, or secret sauce as it's sometimes called, which is just ketchup and mayonnaise. Very
that's all it
secret
is.
sauce.
Fascinating.
So what do you think about this in terms of gatekeeping and the cooking and family connections, all of this?
Well, the funny thing is, it's a really great question, and it immediately made me think of my grandmother, who was like this, and now she's died, when I was 11 or 12, and I'm very mad at her now because I'm quite sure that she was hiding them so that we would miss her more.
So passive aggressive.
It really, she was sort of, or maybe just direct aggressive. Like she, so we could say, I miss the way Grandma made doma, and I try to make it, but she hid that secret ingredient from us, so it just won't ever be the same.
Yeah.
And I was telling my boyfriend Larry about this, and he said, "Why are you mad at her?" And I said, "Because I'm now chasing this thing that makes this delicious. I'm annoyed that every time I make it, it's not as good."
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, it's really added a lot of momentum to your chase for that flavor." And so maybe she knew what she was doing.
That's real. I'll say that the reason I kept my secret cookie recipe so secret was because it was pretty straightforward. Like my secret recipe is that you take the Toll House recipe and you substitute half of the butter for Crisco and then add a little extra flour and make them pretty chunky. And that's a particular type of chocolate chip cookie or any type of cookie that people like. But like no one wants to be like, what the secret is.
I know.
Shortening.
Actually, Anne, I think you're right that a lot of the secret ingredients are kind of embarrassing secrets. Yeah. I think for some of the Armenian secret ingredients for Armenian American old ladies was like this thing called Gravy Master. It's this sort of like kind of gross, it's this kind of sticky yellow four substance.
Yeah.
Another was Lipton's onion powder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like really, it's just salt.
Yeah. It's just like
salt and chemicals.
Yes. Like a binding agent for the gravy, right? Yeah. That's fascinating.
That's a great question.
Just shorten. Yeah, I think too, like it's fun to have something that feels like your own.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. Especially if you arrive at it in some capacity, and like other people who sell cookbooks, like they profit. They get like, and I don't mean this in a crass way, like they are able to profit from their secret recipes.
It's true. Yeah.
And if you do not want to sell your secret recipe, the way that you confer value onto it is you make it incredibly valuable through the fact that no one else can make it.
Exactly. It really is. It does give it a value that it would lose entirely.
Yeah. And I think too, like some of this historically, the way that recipes circulated in a small town, like there would be the recipes that maybe you would clip from the newspaper or from a magazine and that were passed down to you. But then there were like everyone had a potato salad recipe, or like, I love looking at the old Lutheran church recipe books from Minnesota that like my mom contributed to and my grandma contributed to, and everyone has like a Kringler recipe. And you have to figure out, okay, so it just says things like Flo's Kringler.
Exactly.
Laura's Kringler. And you have to figure out whose is the best, right? And so there's a currency, especially amongst people who maybe didn't have social currency in other ways, of having the best.
It's a really good point. And those community cookbooks are like incredible documents. You can get them also at like secondhand stores. A lot of times I've accumulated too many of them, but it's true. Even the Armenian ones, it'll say like it'll have like 7 different types of cheddar. It's just a little different, right? Like just one ingredient different, or things are just like the ratios are a little bit different, and it's very unhelpful when you're looking through it. But you're right. At the time and in that community, it ascribed like kind of different values to different families.
Like maybe you could find the one that most tasted like the one that felt like home to you.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And sometimes some of those people are from, it would say, sort of Harput kefta versus Tokat kefta, which like from different actual cities within this region in Anatolia that they were all from. It's cool. Good stuff.
I also think that the sharing of family recipes isn't a universal experience. And some of this, I think, happened in the post-war era, post-World War II era, when assimilation and fast food and all of these different things kind of short-circuited some of the passage of these recipes. But we have a question from a listener named Lindy about what that feels like.
My parents didn't really cook when I was growing up, so I don't really have family recipes that were taught to me or handed down. Is it really that common for people to have these nostalgic recipes? Is it regional? Is it class related? So many other kids I knew were similarly growing up on hamburger helper and lunch meat sandwiches.
So what do you think here?
I love this question.
Me too.
And I think it's probably common for families to have ways that they show love. And how that happens, or whether that happens through food, is probably cultural and regional. I think I told the story at the beginning of my mother making cheese bedeg as a way to, nurture or show love. It's a very ritual act. My partner, Larry, his family is a big Irish Catholic family from Philly, and they don't have a lot of recipes that they've passed down. And when you do sort of ethnicity research, you learn that the descendants of Irish immigrants don't really have a lot of food traditions. They're descendants of the potato famine. They have other traditions. But they're also from Philly, and so their love language is ham and cheese sandwiches.
Yeah.
And there's an art to all of it. There's an art to the roll. There's an art to the thinness of the ham slice and the type of cheese and the thickness of the cheese and the amount of mayo and the pickle or the no pickle. And when I met his parents, his father gave me a slice of ham that was rolled in cheese and sort of winked at me and gave it to me. And it was like, it spoke. It was like, you're in, It was a really loving act. And so I think it really is cultural and regional, and it can be many things. It doesn't have to be an ancient delicacy or whatever.
That's such a good point. It also really makes me want to eat that sandwich right now.
It's so good. It's the best.
I mentioned this in the prelude to this question, but I think about how like my grandma became a really bad cook in the post-war era. And my grandma on the other side, also horrible cook. And sometimes people are like offended that I say that.
Yeah.
But it's how they were taught, like their understanding of aspirational middle-class cooking was to cook everything canned with recipes from Better Homes and Gardens or whatever,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
So, and again, this is very Midwestern, like they left behind the recipes that might have been passed down, save for desserts and special occasions.
Right.
As a mode of assimilation, right? So they were, on my Norwegian side, it's my grandma's mom only spoke Norwegian. So then they were like the first real assimilationists. And also we're coming out of the Depression, like that 1-2 punch of Depression, World War II sacrifice. Suddenly we have we have a dishwasher and we're expected to cook uniquely with cream of mushroom soup.
It's a really amazing point.
That it just cut off
Yeah.
the lineage in some ways, right? And then you also have the way that more and more women entering the workforce, I think, also serves to change some of the texture of like what recipes did and did not get passed down.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like there were always women in the workforce who were still cooking like that. And there are women in the workforce today who are still cooking, obviously. But like if you have women whose primary job is no longer keeping house,
Yeah.
then the maintenance of those recipes in some ways deteriorates.
Yeah. So before post-war era, we think about our ancestors, and they were like often, if they were keeping house, cooking was like one of the few creative outlets they had.
Yep.
And so they were really, really good at the things they made because they were making it repeatedly. They were keeping some sort of culture alive doing it. And it was like a source of pride for their family, some sort of identity marker for them and their family. And then you're saying, I think back to actually the way that that my mother cooked, although she had her sort of historic recipes. But back then, a lot of moms, you're right, they worked. And then there were like a couple dishes every parent did in America. It was like a piece of fish, meatloaf, chicken, lasagna. Maybe there was a taco night.
Spaghetti with Prego.
Spaghetti with Prego, totally.
Taco night that's like hard shell tacos with
totally.
like...
No authentic Mexican taco.
And just like some like ground beef with taco seasoning on top, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And taco sauce.
And maybe to impress their guests or something, they would cook French or Italian from the joy of cooking.
Right.
But it wasn't, it wasn't what it is now.
I think probably it does have something to do with how many generations you are removed from immigration to a new country too, because if you are new to a place and maybe don't have a ton of money, you want to cook in a way that has the least waste possible, which means you cook the recipes that are most familiar to you, that you know exactly how to cook, right?
Right.
Like I always think about, there's this article in the New York Times that's like going after people who say that, as a new mom, you should be introducing your kid to every new food possible, like that's a sign of great parenting, with no acknowledgement of how that sort of food waste, like the cost of that sort of food waste, if you are a parent, if you're trying to parent on a budget. So I think there's all of those different things intersecting. And then I want to return to your original point, which is that food tradition can take so many different forms.
It could be boxed brownies.
Yes.
Yeah.
It could be Toll House cookies with Crisco.
Absolutely. It's some of the best and most comforting food traditions.
So we've got 2 more questions that will have more practical answers, and we're going to discuss them in the Ask Aunt Anything part of the show. This would normally be paywalled, but today's episode is free for everyone. First up is this question from Jess, who's another one of our beloved paid subscribers.
Adding my voice to the outcry of why does the internet make it so hard to decide what to cook? Currently, I'm trying to find good options for meal prepping lunches to take to work, and between New York Times Cooking, America's Test Kitchen, a bunch of Substacks, and many actual cookbooks, I am overwhelmed by choice, and I'm probably just going to make the same kale Caesar salad I always make. Besides being paralyzed by choice, I admit I have hangups about wasting food. I don't want to try a new recipe that ends up being disappointing and wasteful. How can I just jump in and start making the recipes I've saved and bookmarked and Post-it noted?
Wow. Had Jess already listened to our entire episode?
I know.
She's taking all of our themes and wrapping them up for us.
I know. It's really good.
All right. So does this feeling feel familiar to you?
Yeah, definitely feels familiar. I've personally totally given up. But one thing I have found is YouTube can be helpful for this. How I meal prepped for a week kind of a thing. I like places where actually they're thinking about the cost element and the waste element of preparing for a period of time and keeping that in mind. It's really necessary if you're going to try to figure out something with so many moving parts. It's really hard to go through a million tabs. And one thing needs spinach, and the other needs kale, and the other needs chicken, and the other needs tofu. I find that really helpful. Also, I don't know, Facebook groups are kind of good for this, I think. Just like communities where you can kind of talk to people who do it and they find situations that work for them. I think a lot of parents, I know my sister has some trouble figuring out what to feed her kid for lunch every day. So they get help from other parents. What do you think, Ann?
I used to be very good at this first when I was a grad student in Poor, because I would just like make the same things almost all the time and then eat them for 2 days. And I still do that. My partner and I still do that. Like we make a big meal and we eat it for the second day too.
Yeah.
I got really good at it during the pandemic because trying to dramatically decrease the number of store visits. And then I live on an island that doesn't have a grocery store. We have like a bodega essentially.
Right.
And once a year, the ferry goes out for 3 to 4 weeks. And so you could still go on a foot ferry, but most people try to stock up for as much as they possibly can for those 3 to 4 weeks.
Wow, that's so cool. That's such a great way of thinking about cooking.
Yeah. So it's really useful. I plan out, my partner and I come up with a list of things that we'd like to eat. And then we have to plan out like the stuff that uses the most fresh vegetables first. And then at the end, there's like the dregs, right? And so it's always like some version of pasta e sisi, because all you need is a little bit of kale, and kale can last for so long.
It's true.
So, and you can also get, like, if one of the farm stands is open, you can get it from there. So, or we had like some old Trader Joe's meatballs in the freezer, and we're like, let's get a nice canned spaghetti sauce and then put it on pasta.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Turns out it's pretty good. Yeah, really incredible.
Yeah, I think that like, and I'm really mindful of this in terms of like splitting household labor. And this applies too if you are a person who lives by themselves and is overwhelmed by the idea of, I somehow I always have to cook for myself. Isn't that the worst?
I know.
So I try to really share the listing of ideas of things that we would like to make, and then put that into like a weekly or bi-weekly shopping trip, and then just be like, and then we're going to do this and we're going to do this, and cook the things that need the freshest stuff first.
Yes. Yeah. I agree. When I lived alone, I did a lot of cooking on Sunday and then freezing in individual portions, and then so I could like kind of take things from the week before, so I wasn't so bored eating the same thing for too long a period of time. And now my partner and I, we do sort of Sundays, we like do it together. We're like, at a farmer's market or at a supermarket, like, oh yeah, that sounds good. Okay, we could do that for Monday. Okay, Wednesday we could do that. Okay, yeah, we could use that for that. Yeah. And
or even the idea of a keeper, right? Like there's a Smitten Kitchen cookbook called Keepers. Like if you have a list on your fridge door that says Keepers, and you add a recipe to that, then you can consult that list. Like, I think having it not just as something on your computer, because there's too much shit in our digital lives. Like if you have something that you have written out that references the things that you really like and want to go back to and know that you can do well, it's amazing.
It's a really good idea. Put it on your fridge.
Fridges are meant to be cluttered and have handwritten things on them anyway.
Absolutely.
So that is my firmest belief.
It shows a life well lived.
Okay, but what about this question about like risk? I think this goes back to something we were discussing before about this idea that like your hobby, you should be good at your hobby. Yeah,
it goes back to this thing that I keep reminding myself to do, which is like, don't try to make the best. Like it's actually, you get a good story out of messing something up. You learn some technique from messing something up. It all becomes part of, like, I try to think about cooking as like a bigger sort of exploratory thing that I'm doing. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, I can go to somebody who knows more than me and say, like, I bought all these sweet potatoes and I did that thing so that I could eat them all week, but then I burned them. And what am I supposed to do? And then some elder can like teach me something that then I implement the next time. And then suddenly you're kind of, it's almost like, if you don't do it and mess it up, if you don't just like kind of commit to one, give it a shot, and then make a fun framing around it, even if you mess it up, it's all kind of part of it.
Yeah, and it's ultimately not that big of a loss.
No, not at all.
Unless you're cooking 70 lobsters.
Right.
Don't do that without some expertise.
Yeah.
Can I give my one tip?
Please.
Yes, Melody.
If you're going to try something new that you're really nervous about, just have a variety of hot sauces on hand because anything kind of gross can be improved with sriracha or Cholula. Ask
Or chili
me how
crisp.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. You're like, oh, this is kind of bland. More salt, more hot sauce.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
And the other is just to actually make a sort of game around it. Sometimes I'm like, I have too many lentils. I just this week
Yes.
I'm using the stuff in my I'm using the lentils. I'm using the black beans.
Yes.
And then
I
I
like
think
that.
that'll make it fun.
It's almost like gamification. You're
Yes.
like, how many dishes can I make from the dishes?
How do I get rid of all this oatmeal?
How many farts can I add to this household?
Turns out endless.
Okay, our last question is from another paid subscriber, Casey, and it's one that I see every time that I do a "What are you cooking?" thread in the Culture Study newsletter. So let's hear it.
How do you keep your recipes organized? Are people printing these things? Is Pinterest still a thing people under the age of 60 use? I have a New York Times subscription and many beloved cookbooks with dog-eared pages and a handful of sites that I refer to constantly for inspiration. But is there like an app for that? Am I trying to optimize a thing that is fundamentally not meant to be optimized? My grandma had a shoebox and those church lady spiral-bound cookbooks. My mom has a recipe card binder and a lot of magazine clippings. All I have is chaos and a sometimes good memory for where I found things, but there's got to be a better way.
Okay, so there is an app for this that I
Oh.
do not use,
What's the app?
but that has become highly recommended from other people, which it's called Paprika. And I think that to get full utility, you have to subscribe. So it's yet another thing to subscribe to. But I think if you really are devoted to doing this sort of recipe organization, then it's worthwhile. This is going to be my chance to wax nostalgic about the way that my mom organizes recipes, which is she prints them out or tears them from pages. RIP, like all of the old magazines that we used to actually tear it out from. Although I did she cooked a recipe from the Seattle Times, the print Seattle Times the other week, and I asked for it and it was great. She took a picture of the print Seattle Times and sent it to me. And I carried on that tradition when I left home, and I had a big binder, like a 3-ring binder, 3 inches, that had all of my recipes organized by appetizer, main,
I love that.
pasta, dessert, all of these different things. And there's something so wonderfully tactile about it. Mm-hmm. And you would write, and I still do this in my cookbooks, every time that you make it, who you made it for.
Yes.
And any notes about additions and that sort of thing.
Yes.
The closest I have to that now, I sloughed off that cookbook in one of many, many moves, and I'm still kind of sad about it. But the closest I have to that now is my copy of Melissa Clark's Dinner, which was like my pandemic Bible. Mm-hmm. And I've cooked nearly everything in it, and it is like the best sort of wrinkled and grease marked, and has many different marks of different different times that we made different recipes in quarantine and still today.
Yeah.
But what's your tip?
I think that's really good advice. Actually, one of my tips is going to be the same, which is that every time you cook something from a cookbook, to write the date at the top and who you cooked it for. And my advice initially was to kind of let the produce or the food help choose for you. So if you know you want shrimp or fennel or something, then give yourself a time limit and kind of think back to things that you've made that were similar. And sometimes you'll find yourself on a page where you'd written about other times that you had cooked it for other people, and actually you start to develop your own little collection of recipes. But the other thing, I think you're right. I really actually, this makes me want to go back and do this. Print out the stuff that you like, or that you really believe you want to make, and make your own. Put it together. Actually, the tangible stuff is the stuff that makes the internet feel less endless and scary and unorganizable.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I think a lot of us are trying our best to do. In a way, that was kind of what I did when I made my family cookbook, was just to kind of just put everything together, ask everyone in my family who made things that I knew we loved and wanted to keep, and just like put it all together and print it out for all of us so that we could hold it in our hands. And now we all use it all the time, which is my favorite thing about it. Not that they liked it, whatever, but we use it. Which is nice.
And that's the thing, is that the thing that you use is the thing that's right? So like this Paprika app, I think that I would download it and then not use it very often. Yeah. Unfortunately. And so I have to figure out, okay, what is the actual way that I use stuff? And as much as I fucking hate printers with every single ounce of my being, and I think this is a particular millennial affliction because the printers that we had when we graduated were so bad that we're traumatized by horrible printers. And now there's all these like cheap, very reliable printers. Like the Brother printer is so easy. It doesn't need to be in color. It's just so straightforward.
I know, and you print it through Wi-Fi from your phone, and it feels like the future somehow.
But somehow I can't get my current computer to connect to it. So anytime I need something printed, I have to send a PDF to my partner and be like, can you print this? Like I'm a 2-year-old. But the best app or the best organizational tool is the one that you will use. And so for me, that might be printing out recipes and stuffing them in the pages of the other cookbooks that I go to most often.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really, really great strategy.
And it's totally hideous, but also great, right?
It works.
So that is our advice. Like, I think that people were hoping that you would have, or I would have some like genius hack. But the truth is that no genius hack is out there because we live in this era where stuff is all over the place in our lives, right?
And actually, like, if your brain naturally optimizes in that way, then, like, you will have found your system. And the best advice I can give is just, like, if you don't have a system, it's fine. None of us do. And just find the little things that work for you. Like printing out your things and putting them in the cookbooks that you use the most.
And you know what might be a fun exercise? And maybe I'll do this year. You know, at the end of the year, it's fun to do sort of like reflective exercises in some capacity that aren't about, you know, like instead of resolving to like cook more new recipes, which is such like a common new resolution.
For sure.
Instead,
and easy to break.
look back on what you actually made that year. See if you can remember, right?
Yeah.
Leaf through your cookbooks, go into your New York Times app, like go into your email, see what you actually cooked. And then take the ones that you like the most and turn that into a little cookbook of 2024.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. I'll do that too.
Yeah. Maybe we can come back and talk about it more.
Yeah, perfect. Okay.
Check back in January.
How do we do? Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you on the internet if they want to hear more from you?
Thank you, Anne. This was like the joy of my life. It was really so much fun. People can find me on Instagram at Lilah Rap. I'm there a lot asking questions and making stuff and ruining recipes and all that stuff. I also host the Life and Art podcast. So wherever you listen, just search for Life and Art with FT Weekend.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you that you don't want to miss any of them. Some of the shows we're planning include Queer Pop Stars, Midwestern Masculinity, Why Thrifting Absolutely Sucks Now, Women's Sports, and something we're calling What the Fuck is Going On with This Clothing Brand. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only Advice Time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod or check the show notes for a link. Again, today's episode is free for everyone, so if you like what you hear and you want to support the show, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive Advice Time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. And if you're already a Culture Study newsletter subscriber, you get a significant amount off. So there's actually a place where you can subscribe at the end of your Culture Study newsletter. It takes you directly to the place where you get the discount code. If for some reason you can't figure it out, just send me an email and I'll help you out. For our discussion this week, I'd love to hear about how you manage that tension between heritage recipes and contemporary recipes, or how you organize your recipes. It'd be really great to hear. You can just go to culturestudypod.substack.com and we will all be hanging out there talking about it. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod. Thank you so much.